Is the Shroud of Turin a fake? In 2025, headlines declared it's a medieval forgery based on recent rediscovered documents. We'll grab a cup of coffee, pull up a chair, and let's talk. Hi, I'm Tom Dallis, theologian, author, and apologist, and this is Tom versus the Internet, where we take one topic and discuss it in about 10 minutes. Although, fair warning, this one may run just a couple minutes longer. Now, when it comes to the Shroud of Turin, there are basically two camps: those who think it's genuine and those who do not. Those who think it's not genuine are called medievalists because they believe that the shroud is a forgery coming from the Middle Ages. And those who think that it's authentic believe that it is the actual burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Now, I'm going to be upfront with you. I'm persuaded by the evidence for its authenticity. Now, if that's enough reason for you to tune out, fair enough. But if you want to look at the facts, both for and against, then stay with me. So why am I qualified to talk about this? Well, my doctorate was in New Testament textual criticism, so I've been trained in how to handle and evaluate ancient manuscripts. Now, admittedly, training in New Testament textual criticism isn't the same as training in shroud studies. But what it has given me is a deep appreciation for those who analyze ancient text of any kind, and that perspective will come into play shortly in this video. After that, I did postgraduate work in Jewish culture, the Hebrew Bible, and Jewish New Testament context from the Israel Bible Center. And more recently, I've completed a postgraduate studies in shroud studies from the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum in Rome. I've also studied under shroud scholars, including members of the 1978 STURP team. And STURP stands for Shroud of Turin Research Project, the only group of scientists who examined and ran non-destructive tests on the Shroud of Turin. Most of my professors at the Athenaeum Regina emphasized two things. One, our hope is in Christ, not in the shroud. Even if the shroud is proven false, the resurrection of Jesus remains untouched. And two, don't exaggerate. Overstating a case only gives critics an easy target. Now, this past summer, my wife and I attended the International Shroud Conference in St. Louis, Missouri. We had a chance to meet leading researchers from around the world. And when you look back over the modern debate, 4 objections have really dominated the headlines, with 2 of them surfacing only in the past few months. So let's walk through them. Objection 1. Walter McCrone's paint theory. In the late 1970s and early 80s, microscopist Dr. Walter McCrone argued that the shroud was a painting. He claimed to find iron oxide particles suggesting pigments had been applied, and the media ran with it. But here's what the science showed. The 1978 STURP team, a group that included scientists from NASA, aerospace laboratories, and Los Alamos, studied the cloth for 120 hours using advanced instruments. What's interesting is that many of them thought that the shroud would be disproven in about 10 minutes. Instead, the deeper they looked, the stranger it became. Their conclusion? Quote, no pigments, paints, dyes, or stains have been found on the fibrils. The image is not the product of an artist. Instead, they found the iron oxide traces were natural contaminants, not arranged into the image, and the image itself a faint discoloration on the outmost fibrils, thinner than a human hair. In other words, there simply is not enough residue to support McCrone's painting theory. For those who'd like to read more about the science regarding this in peer-reviewed articles, I've listed them below in the description. So if the shroud is not a painting, what about those carbon-14 dates? Well, that brings us to the second major objection, the 1988 radiocarbon test. In 1988, carbon-14 dating placed the shroud between AD 1260 and 1390. 3 labs ran the test, and the headlines declared the Shroud of Turin is a fake. But serious problems came to light later. The samples weren't blind tested, cleaning was incomplete, and the tested corner may have come from a repaired section. And the full raw data? It wasn't released until 2017 when researcher Tristan Casabianca obtained it through a Freedom of Information request. His peer-reviewed analysis showed that the 3 labs produced inconsistent results that failed standard statistical tests. In other words, the famous 1260 to 1390 range reported in Nature should never have been presented as a single unified date. For those of you who are interested, I've included a link to his peer-reviewed paper in the description of this video. That data revealed conflicting results and poor statistical reliability. Even some skeptics now acknowledge the 1988 test is not conclusive. Meanwhile, several non-destructive tests, spectroscopic, chemical, and mechanical, have all indicated consistency with linen aged around 2,000 years, consistent with a first-century origin. If you want to dig deeper, I've got a 113-page paper on my website, linked in the description below. It covers Jewish burial practices, scriptural references, historical testing, and even a Bayesian probability analysis of authenticity. Objection 3. The bas-relief hypothesis. More recently, researcher Cicero Moreas suggested that the shroud image could have been made by pressing a heated bas-relief statue onto the cloth. Now, just a quick note here. I know that the word looks like bas-relief, like the fish, but it's French, so it's really pronounced bas-relief. Anyway, back to the point. The idea made headlines as a supposed scientific explanation. In fact, one article even concluded that Moreas had proven that it was a bas-relief, which is not at all what his findings showed. But here's the problem. A bas-relief method produces obvious burns and heavy outlines. The shroud image, by contrast, is delicate, only about 200 nanometers deep, and it disappears when the cloth is backlit. The 1978 STIRP team tested scorch theories extensively and ruled them out. And more recent studies have only reconfirmed the shroud is not produced by a scorch or a bas-relief technique. It's also worth pointing out something that many overlook regarding image formation theories, that each of them contradict the other. If the shroud were a bas-relief, then it wasn't painted. And if it were painted, as Walter McCrone argued, then it wasn't a bas-relief. And if it were a primitive photograph from a camera obscura, then it was neither painted nor a bas-relief. Many of these methods can produce images that fool the naked eye, but they can't fool a microscope. The only experiments that have even come close are those using an ultraviolet excimer laser, as researchers at the ENIA laboratories in Italy have shown. They managed to discolor linen fibers to the same shallow depth, but only on tiny patches and only for fractions of a second, on the order of 40 nanoseconds. And even then, no one has come close to reproducing the full image of the shroud. Certainly, such technology was not available in the Middle Ages or the first century, which means that the image had to be formed by a different method. Objection 4A. Nicole Oresme's Note, 2025. The most recent objection was published in 2025 by historian Nicolas Sarzeau and supported by critic and historian André Nicolotti. It's based on notes from a French bishop and philosopher, Nicole Oresme, written in the late 1370s or 1380s. I believe Oresme died in 1382. Oresme wrote that it was said a church in Champagne had the Shroud of Christ, and he added, it must have been painted. However, these were unpublished notes, not the finished book. There's no evidence that Oresme ever saw the shroud, and he gives no description of it, and he uses it as an example in a discussion of false relics, which admittedly were a real problem in the 14th century. But we should also note that simply because there were false relics does not mean that there were not real relics. And painted copies of the shroud were circulating at that time, which could explain his assumption. Modern science, however, has proven that his comment is false. The STURP team, using science, showed that the shroud is not a painting. It is not the work of an artist. Even more so, Sarzeau did not study the original notes directly. He relied primarily on the work of two historians who study Oresme and not the shroud. So, at best, this is a second-hand interpretation of a passing remark. Objection 4B. The Memorandum of Bishop Paris d'Arcy. About 20 years after Oresme, Bishop Paris d'Arcy of Troyes wrote a memorandum claiming the shroud was painted. But his memo only survives in 2 drafts with differences. He names no artist and admitted the claim was second-handed, and there is no evidence it was ever sent to the Pope. What we do have are official bulls from the Pope in 1390, which authorized the shroud's display in Liry with regulations. He did not condemn the shroud as a forgery. In courtroom terms, it would be like a prosecutor, D'Arcy, submitting conflicting hearsay affidavits, and the judge, Clement, ignoring them and allowing the shroud to remain. This brings us to an earlier history of the shroud. Long before the 14th century, Byzantine records describe a cloth with Christ's image venerated in Constantinople, and it's often linked to the image of Edessa. The French knight Robert de Clari, who witnessed the Fourth Crusade in 1203 and 1204, described what he saw in Constantinople. He wrote, "There was another of the churches, which they called My Lady Saint Mary of Blancernay, where was kept the shroud, Sindone, in which our Lord had been wrapped, which every Friday rose up straight, so that one could see the figure of our Lord upon it." This is a stunning description of a cloth showing the full figure of Christ, decades before Geoffroy de Charnay displayed the shroud in France. After the sack of Constantinople in 1204, the cloth disappears from history for about 150 years. Then, in 1350, Geoffroy de Charnay, a noble knight, presented the shroud for public veneration at the church he built in Loire, France. Even earlier, Pope Innocent III at the Fourth Vatican Council in 1215 A.D. warned against false relics and condemned their misuse. While he doesn't mention the shroud specifically, it shows the Church's awareness of relic abuse during this era. He also gave warning that anyone found in possession of a relic taken from another church, such as Constantinople, their souls were in danger of condemnation. So the historical trail is this. A cloth bearing Christ's image is described in Constantinople before 1204, disappears after the sack of the city, and then reemerges in France under Geoffrey de Charnay. So there you have it, the four big objections: McCrone's paint theory, the 1988 carbon dating, the bas-relief hypothesis, and Oresme's note. Each caused a stir when it hit the headlines, but when you look closely, none stand the test of evidence. The shroud itself remains the best witness. It's not a painting. It's not a scorch, not a medieval fake. It bears the image of a scourged, crucified man consistent with the Gospels and Second Temple Jewish burial practices, where same-day burial, fine linen, and secondary burials were observed. And while the 1988 carbon-14 dating is still cited by critics, it's far from the final word. Since then, 5 non-destructive tests have dated the cloth to an age consistent with 2,000-year-old fabric. In other words, multiple scientific approaches point in the opposite direction of the 1988 test. If you want more detail, I've written a 113-page paper on this topic that covers Jewish burial practices, the biblical evidence, the historical trail, and probability factors, which, as I've mentioned, is found in the description of this video. John Adams once said, "Facts are stubborn things." The shroud continues to stand as one of them, a mystery that still draws the attention of science, history, and faith. Now, these aren't the only objections skeptics have raised. Some talk about medieval photography, chemical reactions, or the weave in the cloth. I'll cover those in another video. But if you found this helpful, please like, comment, and share. And don't forget to subscribe. If you'd like more on the shroud, let me know in the comments. I do read them, and I'd love to hear what you think. Until then, thanks for watching, and keep seeking, keep thinking.